I'm Tanya Williams, 72 years old and apparently a burden. That's what my son Jeffrey said when he forgot to hang up the phone after our weekly call. His words pierced my heart like broken glass. She's just becoming a burden. For 30 years, I'd opened my home to him and his family, thinking we were building memories together. I was wrong. While they vacationed in Europe, I made a decision that would change everything. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from, and subscribe if you want to hear more stories like mine. Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. 10 years ago, I lost Harold, my husband, of 42 years, to a sudden heart attack. We had built our colonial-style home in Connecticut together, saving for years to afford the down payment. Over decades, we transformed it from a modest house into a beautiful family home worth $980,000. Every corner held memories of our life together. I raised Jeffrey largely on my own. Harold worked long hours at his engineering firm to ensure we had financial stability. When Jeffrey was 12, Harold passed away unexpectedly while on a business trip. Overnight, I became both mother and father to our grieving son. I took on extra shifts at the hospital where I worked as a nurse to maintain our lifestyle and ensure Jeffrey could still attend the good schools in our district. College was a struggle financially, but I managed to help Jeffrey through his undergraduate degree at Rutgers. I still remember the pride in his eyes when he landed his first job at a marketing firm in Hartford. 3 years later, he met Diane at a company event. She was ambitious, beautiful, and driven. I welcomed her into our family, with open arms, hosting their engagement party in our backyard garden that Harold had meticulously designed. The grandchildren came next. Emily, now 14, was born with a full head of dark hair and eyes that reminded me so much of Harold. Tyler followed 3 years later, a rambunctious boy, who now, at 11, shows the same mechanical aptitude his grandfather had. Those children became the center of my world after Harold left it. I babysat whenever Jeffrey and Diane needed, sometimes for weeks when they traveled for work. I never complained. Family helps family. Last winter, I experienced a minor heart scare. Nothing serious, just elevated blood pressure and some irregular heartbeats that my doctor said were manageable with medication. I downplayed it when telling Jeffrey, but somehow it triggered a shift in his behavior. He and Diane started visiting more frequently, often unannounced. They'd ask probing questions about my medications, my doctor appointments, whether I was eating properly. "Mom, you should take it easy," Jeffrey would say, taking the vacuum from my hands when I was cleaning. "Let me handle that." At first, their concern touched me. It seemed like the natural progression of life, the child beginning to care for the parent. But I remained fiercely independent. I drove myself to appointments, maintained my garden, and kept my home immaculate just as I always had. Our weekly family dinners became a tradition after Harold passed. Every Sunday, Jeffrey, Diane, and the kids would come over for a home-cooked meal. I'd spend the entire day preparing Harold's recipes, preserving that piece of him for all of us. During holidays, my house transformed into a wonderland. Thanksgiving meant Harold's family stuffing recipe and the china we received as wedding gifts. Christmas brought out the decorations we'd collected over 40 years of marriage. Despite my age, I stayed active in the community. 3 days a week, I volunteered at the local library, helping with their literacy program for immigrant families. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I tended the community garden growing vegetables that we donated to the local food pantry. These activities kept me connected, purposeful, and young at heart. The house itself was my greatest pride. Harold and I had purchased it when it needed significant work, and over the years we renovated every inch. He built the wraparound porch where I still drink my morning coffee. Together we installed the hardwood floors, chose the colonial blue paint for the exterior, and planted the maple trees that now tower over the property. After he died, I continued maintaining it perfectly, honoring his memory through our shared dream home. Financially, I was comfortable. The house was fully paid off 15 years ago, and Harold's life insurance combined with his pension, and my retirement savings provided enough for me to live comfortably. I wasn't wealthy, but I wasn't worried about money either. Jeffrey and Diane lived in a smaller home, about 15 minutes away. Their place was nice, but more modest than mine. Constrained by the expensive Connecticut housing market and their desire to live in a top school district for the kids. Whenever they visited, Diane would comment on some aspect of my home. "This bay window is exactly what I've always wanted," she'd say, running her hand along the frame. "They don't build houses with this kind of craftsmanship anymore." Jeffrey would add, tapping the solid wood banister of our staircase. I always took their comments as appreciation for the home Harold and I had created. I never once suspected what was really going through their minds. At 72, I thought I knew my son. I was wrong. April 23rd started like any ordinary Tuesday. The spring weather had finally broken through the long Connecticut winter, and I spent the morning in my garden turning the soil and planning where I'd plant my tomatoes this year. By afternoon, my hands were caked with dirt, and satisfaction warmed me from the inside out. Harold always said working the earth kept us grounded. After a quick shower, I settled in my sunroom with a cup of tea waiting for Jeffrey's weekly call. The phone rang precisely at 4, as it did every Tuesday. Jeffrey's voice came through sounding slightly distracted but warm. "Hi, Mom, just checking in before we leave for Europe on Friday." Jeffrey had been talking about this 3-week family vacation for months. They were starting in London, then Paris, and finishing with a week in Italy. It was the trip of a lifetime for them, especially for the kids who had never been overseas. "Everything's packed," he continued. "Emily can't stop talking about seeing the Eiffel Tower, and Tyler's suddenly interested in Roman history, thanks to some video game." "That sounds wonderful, dear," I replied, genuinely happy for them. "Your father and I always dreamed of taking you to Europe, but we never quite managed it." We chatted about their itinerary, the house sitter they'd arranged, and how the kids were doing in school. Then Jeffrey shifted the conversation. "Do you need anything before we leave? Want me to stop by tomorrow to check your smoke detectors or anything?" "I'm perfectly fine, Jeffrey. Enjoy your vacation. The smoke detectors work fine. I tested them last month when I changed the batteries." "Okay, if you're sure. Well, we'll call when we can with the time difference and everything. Love you, Mom." "Love you too. Have a wonderful trip." There was the sound of what I thought was Jeffrey hanging up, and I set my phone down on the side table. I picked up my novel and was about to resume reading when I heard muffled voices coming from my phone. Jeffrey hadn't properly ended the call. I was about to call out his name when I heard my son's voice now, with a completely different tone. "She's just becoming a burden, Diane. Did you hear how she immediately had to mention that she and Dad never went to Europe? Like I'm supposed to feel guilty about taking our family." My hand froze on the way to the phone. My own son's voice speaking about me in a way I'd never heard before. "I know," Diane's voice replied, slightly distant, as if she was moving around their kitchen. "After Europe, we need to talk about moving her into Sunrise Village. My client's mother is there, and she says it's really nice. Lots of activities, medical staff on site." "The sooner the better," Jeffrey agreed. "Your mom's house would sell for at least $980,000 in this market. The location alone is gold. I was thinking when the house is ours, we should convert that main floor den into a proper home office. And that kitchen needs updating, the appliances are ancient." Mom would never agree to that. She thinks that kitchen is perfect because Dad installed the cabinets. "That's why we need to be smart about this. Diane's voice lowered slightly. "We need to convince her it's for her own good. We've been subtly suggesting she can't manage alone for months now. The increased visits, pointing out little things she's forgotten mentioning how big that house is for one person. Yeah, it's working. She didn't even push back when I took the vacuum from her last week." My hand trembled as I finally reached for the phone and ended the call. The teacup in my other hand clattered against its saucer, spilling tea onto my lap. I barely noticed the warm liquid seeping through my pants. My world had just shattered. For several minutes, I sat completely still replaying the conversation in my mind, hoping I'd misunderstood or imagined it. But the words were clear. My son and his wife had been planning to move me out of my home to take what Harold and I had built together. All their recent caring behavior, the increased concern, the offers of help, were manipulation, a carefully orchestrated campaign to make me doubt my own capabilities. Tears welled in my eyes and spilled down my cheeks. I didn't bother wiping them away. The betrayal cut so deep that it felt physical, like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart. The home office they wanted was where Harold used to read to Jeffrey when he was a boy. The kitchen they thought needed updating was where I'd taught Jeffrey to make his father's famous Sunday pancakes. I sat in that sunroom until darkness fell my tea long cold, remembering every interaction with new clarity. The time Diane commented on how quaint my older appliances were. Jeffrey pointing out a loose porch railing, suggesting the house was becoming too much for me to maintain. The casual mentions of their friends' parents who were so happy in assisted living facilities. "Your house is becoming so valuable in this market," Mom Jeffrey had said just last month. "Have you thought about what you'll do with it long term?" I'd replied that I planned to live in it as long as I could, that it was my home. He'd nodded sympathetically but exchanged a glance with Diane that I now understood. They'd been circling like vultures, waiting for me to become vulnerable enough to push into a facility so they could claim what they thought should be theirs. All while smiling to my face, eating the meals I cooked, accepting the birthday and Christmas gifts I carefully selected each year. As the reality sank, in anger began to replace the shock and hurt. How dare they? I'd given Jeffrey everything. After Harold died, I worked 2 jobs to maintain his lifestyle. I attended every soccer game, every school play. I helped with college applications and celebrated every achievement. When he and Diane needed emergency childcare, I never hesitated. I loved those grandchildren fiercely and had assumed my son loved me the same way. Now I knew better. To Jeffrey and Diane, I wasn't a beloved mother and grandmother. I was a burden with a valuable asset they were waiting to claim. Sleep eluded me that night. I tossed and turned, reliving Jeffrey's words over and over. By dawn, I sat up in bed, my mind suddenly clear. A strange calm settled over me as the first rays of sunlight filtered through my curtains. This was still my house, my life, and I would decide what happened next, not my ungrateful son and his scheming wife. The betrayal still ached, but now it fueled something new: determination. If they thought I was just a helpless old woman, they were about to learn otherwise. That morning, I pulled out my laptop and began researching senior living options. Not Sunrise Village, where Jeffrey and Diane planned to stash me, but communities across the country where I might actually want to live. Places with mild climates, cultural activities, and outdoor recreation. After a few hours, I had a list of possibilities. Next, I called my friend Barbara. We'd been close for 30 years, and she'd retired from real estate just last year. If anyone could help me sell quickly and discreetly, it was Barbara. "Tanya, "Are you sure about this?" she asked, after I explained the situation. "It's a drastic step." "I've never been more certain," I replied. "They betrayed me, Barbara. They've been planning this for months, maybe years." Barbara's voice softened. "Then let's do this right. I know exactly which agents to contact." The following day, I met with Margaret Johnson, an attorney Barbara recommended. Margaret specialized in elder law and had seen situations like mine before. "Unfortunately, Mrs. Williams, what you're describing is not uncommon," she said, her eyes kind behind her professional demeanor. "But the good news is that the house is solely in your name. You have every legal right to sell it. And my son would have no claim, I needed to be certain." "None whatsoever. It's your property to do with as you wish." With Margaret's guidance, I developed a plan. I would sell the house quickly before Jeffrey and his family returned from Europe. I'd relocate somewhere they wouldn't immediately think to look, giving myself time to settle and decide how or if I wanted to reestablish contact. That evening, I pulled out a map and considered my options. The West had always intrigued me. Harold and I had vacationed in Colorado, once staying in a small bed and breakfast outside Boulder. The mountains had taken my breath away, and the town itself had a vibrant energy that appealed to me even now. Most importantly, my college roommate Sandra lived there. We'd kept in touch through Christmas cards and the occasional phone call, but I suddenly remembered her standing invitation to visit. I called her that night, explaining my situation in broad strokes, without all the painful details. "Tanya, I've been telling you to move out here for years," she said. "There's a wonderful community of active seniors. You'd fit right in." The next morning, I began taking inventory of my possessions. The house contained 40 years of accumulated belongings, but I realized only a fraction truly mattered to me. Harold's pocket watch, our wedding album, the quilt my grandmother made, Jeffrey's baby book, and the macaroni art he'd made in kindergarten. Yes, despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to discard those early mementos of my son. While Jeffrey and Diane busied themselves with last-minute trip preparations, I met secretly with 3 realtors. Each was impressed with the condition of my home, complimenting the meticulous maintenance and classic design. The third realtor mentioned that a developer had been looking for properties in my neighborhood, sometimes paying cash for quick closings. "A cash offer would mean we could close in as little as 2 weeks," she explained. That was exactly what I needed. By the end of the week, I had a cash offer for $985,000, $5,000 more than Jeffrey and Diane had estimated. The developer wanted to close in 10 days, well before my family would return from Europe. Margaret helped arrange the expedited closing. She also advised me to open new bank accounts at a different bank, ensuring Jeffrey wouldn't be able to track my finances easily. "Many adult children have access to their parents' bank information," she warned. "Even if Jeffrey doesn't have official Access Bank employees in small towns, sometimes share information with family members." I followed her advice, opening accounts at a national bank with a branch in Boulder. I also contacted a real estate agent there who helped me find a comfortable 2-bedroom condo in a senior-friendly community near the Pearl Street Mall. At Margaret's suggestion, I purchased it through a limited liability company to further obscure the paper trail. Throughout this whirlwind of planning, I experienced moments of doubt and emotional struggle. Late at night, looking at family photos, I questioned whether I was overreacting. But then I'd remember Jeffrey and Diane's calculated words, their plans to remove me from my home under the guise of concern, and my resolve would strengthen again. "You're doing the right thing," Barbara assured me over coffee. "They were planning to take your choices away. You're simply choosing first." 2 days before Jeffrey and his family were set to leave for Europe, I hosted a farewell dinner. I cooked all their favorites from Harold's famous pot roast to the apple pie Jeffrey had loved since childhood. Throughout the meal, I searched their faces for any sign of guilt or discomfort, any indication that they recognized the magnitude of their betrayal. There was nothing. Jeffrey checked his phone repeatedly, preoccupied with travel details. Diane talked incessantly about the cooking class she'd booked in Tuscany. The children at least were affectionate, Emily helping me clear dishes, and Tyler giving me a tight hug before they left. "See you when we get back," Mom Jeffrey called as they climbed into the taxi that would take them to the airport. "We'll bring you something nice from Paris." I stood on the porch waving until their taxi disappeared around the corner. Little did they know it was the last time they would see their childhood home as they knew it. A single tear slid down my cheek, not for the house I was about to leave, but for the relationship I had thought was built on love and respect, not greed and convenience. The moment their plane took off for London, my plan shifted into high gear. I had exactly 21 days before their return, but the most critical phase needed to happen within the first 72 hours. First thing Friday morning, a team of professional movers arrived. I had hired them through Barbara's recommendation, paying extra for their discretion and efficiency. They specialized in helping seniors downsize understanding which items held emotional value and treating everything with respect. "Where would you like to start, Mrs. Williams?" asked Tony, the crew leader. "The attic," I replied firmly. "That's where the hardest memories are stored." For decades, I'd preserved Jeffrey's childhood belongings in carefully labeled boxes. Now I sorted through them quickly. I kept a few treasured items, the ones that represented the son I thought I knew. Not the man who called me a burden when he thought I couldn't hear. The rest I divided between donations and a small box of keepsakes for Emily and Tyler. Whatever their parents' failings, the children deserved connections to their heritage. By Saturday afternoon, the moving company had packed all my personal belongings for shipment to Boulder. The amount was surprisingly small, fitting into their medium-sized truck with room to spare. 40 years in this house, and I could take my true treasures with me in a single vehicle. Next came the furniture. I contacted 3 local charities, arranging for them to collect everything I wasn't taking with me. Harold and I had purchased quality pieces that would serve other families well. The dining table, where we'd shared thousands of meals, would now nourish another family's conversations. Our bedroom set, where I'd spent my last night with Harold before his heart attack would cradle another couple's dreams. "Are you sure you want to donate this?" asked the volunteer from the women's shelter when she saw our leather sofa set. "It's practically new." "I'm positive," I said. "It needs to be used, not stored away." On Sunday, I tackled the family photos. This proved more emotional than I'd anticipated. There was Jeffrey at 5, grinning with his first lost tooth. Jeffrey at 16, proudly holding his driver's license. Jeffrey and Diane on their wedding day, with Harold and me beaming beside them. So many captured moments of what I'd thought was a loving family. I allowed myself an hour to cry, to mourn not just the loss of my home, but the shattering of my family illusions. Then I carefully selected photos to take with me, packed the rest for storage, and moved on. By Monday morning, the house was half empty. The movers had taken my personal belongings. The charities had collected the furniture, and I'd packed my car with essentials for the drive to Colorado. The closing was scheduled for 2 o'clock at Margaret's office. I walked through each room, saying goodbye to the spaces that had witnessed my life's greatest joys and deepest sorrows. The kitchen, where Harold taught Jeffrey to make pancakes on Sunday mornings. The living room where we'd opened Christmas presents for decades. The backyard where Jeffrey had married Diane, under an arch of roses that Harold had planted. In each empty room, I left behind not just physical possessions, but the weight of expectations. The belief that sacrificing for family meant they would value you. The assumption that a mother's love would be met with a son's respect. At Margaret's office, I signed the closing documents with a steady hand. When she handed me the cashier's check, a surreal feeling washed over me. My home of 40 years had been reduced to a piece of paper. But that paper represented freedom, a chance to start anew at 72. The funds will be in your new account by tomorrow morning, Margaret confirmed, and the LLC for your Colorado property is finalized. Thank you for everything, I said, meaning it. Her efficiency and understanding had made this possible. Back at the house, now legally no longer mine, I performed one final task. At my kitchen counter on a piece of Harold's stationery, I wrote a note. I heard what you said. I'm not a burden anymore. I've made my own choices just as you've made yours. Mom. I placed it on the empty mantel where family photos had once stood, where Jeffrey would be sure to see it when they returned to find the locks changed and the house emptied of 40 years of memories. Standing in the empty foyer, I felt a transformation complete within me. I was no longer just Tanya, the mother, the widow, the grandmother who existed to serve her family's needs. I was Tanya Williams, a woman with decades of life experience, making choices for her own happiness. I locked the door behind me one last time and placed the key in the lockbox for the new owners. My car was packed, my route mapped out, and a new life awaited. I didn't look back as I drove away from the house that had sheltered so many memories. Those memories traveled with me, but the burden of living up to others' expectations remained behind. The drive to Boulder took 4 days. I could have made it in 3, but I decided to take my time to appreciate the journey as much as the destination. After decades of putting everyone else first, these days on the open road belonged entirely to me. I stopped in Pittsburgh the first night, staying at a charming bed and breakfast near the University District. The next morning I visited the Andy Warhol Museum, something I'd always wanted to do but had never prioritized. Harold had been more interested in natural history museums, and family vacations had centered around Jeffrey's interests. In Chicago, I spent a full day at the Art Institute, wandering through the Impressionist galleries that had only existed in art books on my coffee table. Standing before Monet's water lilies, I felt a sense of connection to something timeless and beautiful. My life was changing dramatically, but these paintings had witnessed generations of human drama. Crossing the Mississippi River into Iowa, I felt the symbolic weight of the moment. I was literally leaving my old life behind, crossing into territory unknown. The flat farmlands gradually gave way to the rolling plains of Nebraska, and I spent a night in a small town where the hotel clerk called me Honey and recommended a local diner that served pie just like my grandmother used to make. By the time the Rocky Mountains appeared on the horizon, rising majestically against the blue sky, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. My heart still ached from Jeffrey's betrayal, but the pain was accompanied by a new sense of possibility. Boulder welcomed me with sunshine and crisp mountain air. I arrived at Sandra's condominium complex on a Thursday afternoon, following her detailed directions to the visitor parking area. She was waiting outside, her silver hair cropped short, her smile just as warm as it had been in our college days. "Tanya Williams!" she exclaimed, embracing me tightly. "You finally made it to Colorado." "Better late than never," I replied, returning her hug. Sandra had arranged for me to stay with her until my condo was ready the following week. Her guest room overlooked a garden courtyard where residents gathered in the evenings for wine and conversation. That first night, she introduced me to several neighbors, all active retirees with fascinating stories. "Everyone here has reinvented themselves at least once," Sandra explained as we prepared dinner together. Jim was a corporate lawyer who now teaches pottery. Maria retired from medicine and writes mystery novels. You'll fit right in. My condo was in a similar community just 10 minutes away. When the real estate agent gave me the tour, I immediately felt at home. The space was smaller than my Connecticut house, but it was bright and open with large windows framing mountain views. The community featured walking paths, a pool and a calendar full of activities from book clubs to hiking groups. The previous owner left most of the furniture, the agent explained. She moved to be closer to grandchildren. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was moving away from grandchildren who didn't know their parents viewed their grandmother as a burden. Setting up my new home proved therapeutic. I arranged only things I truly loved around me. Harold's books found a place of honor in the built-in shelves. Our wedding photo went on my bedside table. I hung art we'd collected together, but placed it differently, creating new perspectives on familiar pieces. The physical tasks of unpacking and organizing gave my hands purpose while my heart continued its healing process. Each box I emptied represented another step forward. Each decision about where something should go was an assertion of my new independence. Within weeks, I established new routines. Mornings began with coffee on my small balcony, watching the sunrise paint the Flatirons in golden light. Then, a walk along the community trails, nodding to neighbors who quickly became familiar faces. Afternoons might include volunteering at the local library, similar to what I'd done in Connecticut, or exploring Boulder's downtown. Sandra introduced me to her book club, a lively group of women who welcomed me warmly. When they learned I'd been a nurse, they immediately recruited me for their community health committee. "We need someone who can translate medical jargon," explained Greta, a retired teacher, with a no-nonsense attitude I admired instantly. I also joined a beginner's watercolor class, something I'd always wanted to try but never made time for. My first attempts were laughably bad, but the instructor, a patient man named Thomas, assured me that everyone started somewhere. By the third class, I produced a landscape that, while far from gallery-worthy, gave me immense satisfaction. Meanwhile, the digital trail I'd left behind began to light up. My old phone, which I kept charged but mostly ignored, accumulated voicemails and texts from Jeffrey. The first few were casual checking in from Europe. Then came the frantic messages when they returned to find the house sold and empty. "Mom, what's going on? Call me immediately." "Where are you?" "The neighbors said you sold the house." "This isn't funny." "Mom, we're worried sick. Please call us." Each message revealed more of their panic and disbelief. I listened to them all but responded to none. They had made plans for my life without consulting me. Now I was making plans without consulting them. 1 month into my new Colorado life, I realized I was smiling more often. The mountain air seemed to carry away some of the heaviness in my heart. I found myself engaging with new acquaintances more openly than I had in years. "You look different today," Sandra commented one morning as we walked together. "New haircut." I touched my hair, recently styled in a more modern cut than the conservative bob I'd worn for decades. The stylist suggested it. Too young for me. "Not at all. It suits you. Everything here seems to suit you, Tanya." She was right. Somehow, in this place where no one knew me as Jeffrey's mother or Harold's widow, I was rediscovering aspects of myself that had been buried under layers of family responsibility. The bookish college girl who loved poetry. The young nurse who'd dreamed of working with Doctors Without Borders before marriage and motherhood redirected her path. The woman who had opinions and preferences independent of her roles as caretaker. "I think I'm finally becoming myself again," I told Sandra over wine one evening. or maybe becoming myself for the first time. My new community embraced me without knowing my painful history. To them, I was simply Tanya, the new resident, with the Eastern accent and the quick laugh. They invited me to potlucks and movie nights, hiking excursions, and volunteer projects. Gradually, the ache of betrayal became just one part of my story, not its defining feature. 2 months after arriving in Boulder, I felt settled enough to consider the question that had been hovering at the edges of my consciousness. What would my relationship with Jeffrey and his family look like going forward? The answer wasn't simple, but I knew it would be on my terms, not theirs. When I was ready, not when they demanded it. As autumn painted the aspens gold against the evergreen mountains, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. At 72, I wasn't just starting over. I was discovering a version of myself that had been waiting patiently all along. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived on a crisp October morning. I had just returned from a walk when my phone rang with Jeffrey's number. Usually, I let his calls go to voicemail, but something told me it was time. I had established my new life. I was ready to face the old one. "Hello, Jeffrey," I answered calmly. The silence on the other end lasted so long, I thought he might have hung up. Then his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Mom, you actually answered." "Yes, I did. Where are you? What happened?" We came home, and the house was empty. The locks changed. There was just that note. I could picture exactly what had happened. They would have returned from Europe, tanned and tired luggage, loaded with souvenirs, expecting everything to be exactly as they left it. Jeffrey would have inserted his key into the front door lock, jiggling it when it didn't turn, assuming it was stuck. The confusion would have turned to concern, then alarm. A neighbor would have approached, sharing the news that I had sold the house weeks ago. Inside, they would have found nothing but empty rooms and my brief note on the mantel. "I heard your conversation with Diane Jeffrey after our phone call in April. You didn't hang up properly." Another long silence. "Then, Mom, I can explain. You called me a burden. You and Diane were planning to move me into Sunrise Village so you could take my house. You were discussing renovations as if the property was already yours." It wasn't like that he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. It was exactly like that. I heard every word. In the background, I could hear Diane's voice asking what I was saying. Then a rustle, as Jeffrey presumably covered the phone to respond to her. When he returned, his tone had hardened. "You had no right to sell that house without talking to us first. Do you have any idea what you've done? We've been staying with Diane's parents for weeks. Emily had to change schools mid-semester because we're not in the district anymore." His entitlement took my breath away. Even now, he saw my home as something he had rights to my life decisions, as something that required his approval. "I had every right, Jeffrey. The house was mine, not yours. You seem to have forgotten that. Where are you? We need to talk about this in person." "I'm in Boulder, Colorado." "Colorado." His voice rose in disbelief. "What on earth are you doing in Colorado?" "Living my life on my terms." Diane's voice grew louder in the background, and suddenly she was on the phone. "Tanya, how could you do this to your own grandchildren? They're devastated." Tyler cries himself to sleep asking for his grandma. "Is that what you wanted?" The guilt tactic might have worked once, but I was prepared for it. "I love Emily and Tyler very much, Diane. My issue isn't with them. It's with you and Jeffrey planning to ship me off to a retirement home so you could take my house." "That conversation was private," she sputtered. "You had no right to listen in. And you had no right to plot against me. You both treated me like an inconvenient object rather than a person with feelings and autonomy. Jeffrey took the phone back. "Mom, you're blowing this way out of proportion. We were just discussing options for your future. We worry about you living alone in that big house." "No, Jeffrey. You weren't worried. You were calculating. There's a difference." My calm certainty seemed to finally penetrate his defenses. His voice cracked slightly. "What do you want from us? An apology? Fine. I'm sorry we discussed those things. But selling the house and disappearing was extreme. I don't want anything from you right now, Jeffrey. I'm calling the shots in my own life. Something you and Diane were planning to take away from me." The conversation continued in circles Jeffrey, alternating between self-justification and attempts to make me feel guilty. Diane occasionally interjected with comments designed to remind me of family obligations. I remained steady, neither raising my voice nor backing down. Finally, Jeffrey asked the practical question. "What about the money from the house that was supposed to be our inheritance?" "Supposed to be? I wasn't dead yet, Jeffrey. You know what I mean. The money is secure and being well managed. Some of it purchased my condo here. Some is invested for my future needs. And us. What about what Dad would have wanted us to have? Your father would have wanted me to be treated with respect by our son, not called a burden and plotted against." I replied the words sharp, despite my controlled tone. "But since you're asking, I've set aside funds for Emily and Tyler's education. They'll receive that money when they're ready for college, regardless of our relationship status." This revelation clearly caught him off guard. "You're still providing for the kids. They're innocent in all this, Jeffrey. My issues are with you and Diane, not with them." By the end of our hour-long conversation, the initial anger had given way to an uncomfortable truce. Jeffrey finally admitted that they had indeed been planning to encourage me to move to Sunrise Village within the year. Diane acknowledged that they had discussed renovations to my house prematurely. "We didn't see it as taking advantage," Jeffrey tried to explain. "We thought it was the natural progression. You're getting older. The house is too big for you. We could use the space for our family." The natural progression would have been discussing these concerns with me, openly respecting my wishes and supporting my choices, I countered. Not scheming behind my back. Before ending the call, I laid out my terms for moving forward. I would maintain contact with Emily and Tyler through letters, calls, and eventually visits. Jeffrey and Diane would need to demonstrate genuine respect for my autonomy before I would consider rebuilding our relationship. "I'm not cutting you out of my life permanently," I explained, "but things will be different now. I won't be taken for granted or treated as a burden." "And if we want to visit?" Jeffrey asked tentatively. "Not yet. I need more time. Perhaps after the holidays, if our phone conversations go well." When I finally hung up, I felt drained but empowered. For perhaps the first time in our adult relationship, I had set boundaries with my son that centered my needs rather than his expectations. The conversation hadn't resolved everything, but it had established a new foundation, one built on reality rather than illusion. That evening, I wrote long letters to Emily and Tyler, explaining in age-appropriate terms that I had moved to Colorado to start a new adventure. I enclosed photographs of the mountains and my new home. I promised that our relationship would continue regardless of adult complications. Then I walked to the post office and mailed them myself, another small act of independence. Back in my condo, I sat on my balcony watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. The conversation with Jeffrey had been difficult but necessary. It had confirmed what I already knew: I had made the right choice, not just for now, but for whatever time I had left. 6 months after my arrival in Boulder Spring had transformed the landscape. Wildflowers dotted the hiking trails, and the longer daylight hours energized the entire community. My own transformation mirrored the season's renewal. I had developed a circle of friends, established meaningful routines, and created a life that suited me perfectly. My relationship with Jeffrey had evolved through weekly phone calls. Initially awkward and tension-filled, our conversations gradually became more genuine. He still occasionally slipped into old patterns, suggesting what I should do or expressing concern that masked control, but I became adept at recognizing and redirecting these moments. "I was thinking you should get one of those medical alert buttons," he said during one call. "Thank you for your concern," I replied, "but I've already joined a buddy system with neighbors. We check on each other daily, which works well for us." These small assertions of independence reinforced the new dynamics between us. I was his mother, not his ward. I valued his opinion, but made my own decisions. After much consideration, I invited Jeffrey and his family to visit over spring break. The timing felt right, and I wanted to see my grandchildren. The condo community had guest accommodations they could rent, providing necessary personal space for all of us. Their arrival brought both anxiety and anticipation. Would Jeffrey and Diane truly respect my new life? Would the children still feel connected to me? After months apart, I needn't have worried about Emily and Tyler. They bounded from the rental car with enthusiastic hugs and endless stories. "Grandma, the mountains are huge," Tyler exclaimed, his 11-year-old energy filling my quiet condo. "Your hair looks pretty," Emily offered, always attentive to details at 14. Jeffrey and Diane appeared more cautious, taking in my new surroundings with surprised expressions. Perhaps they had imagined me living in diminished circumstances, proving I needed them. Instead, they found me thriving in a beautiful community with friends and activities. "You look different," Mom Jeffrey said, studying my face. "Happy," I supplied. "The word you're looking for is happy." Diane's smile remained fixed and slightly strained throughout the first day. She complimented my condo, but couldn't resist adding, "It's so much smaller than your house in Connecticut." "Yes," I agreed pleasantly. "Exactly what I wanted. No stairs to climb, no yard to maintain, and just enough space for me and occasional guests." I had planned activities showcasing Boulder's attractions. We hiked easy trails, suitable for the children, explored Pearl Street's shops, and attended a concert at the university. Throughout the visit, I maintained my regular activities, including my watercolor class, where Emily joined me, showing surprising talent. Jeffrey gradually relaxed as he saw how well I had adapted. One evening, while the children and Diane were swimming in the community pool, he and I shared a quiet moment on my balcony. "I owe you a real apology, Mom," he said, looking out at the mountains rather than at me. "What Diane and I did, the way we talked about you, it was wrong. I convinced myself we were thinking of your best interests, but that wasn't the whole truth." I let his words hang in the air, giving them the weight they deserved. "The house represented financial security for us," he continued. "With college costs coming up for the kids, property values rising, I started seeing your home as a solution to our problems rather than as your home." "Thank you for acknowledging that," I said finally. "It hurt deeply to realize how you viewed me. I never meant to make you feel like a burden. You've been the opposite my entire life, always giving, always supporting." Perhaps that was part of the problem, I reflected. I gave so completely that you came to expect it to see my resources as extensions of your own. He nodded slowly. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since you left, about the kind of son I've been, the kind of example I'm setting for Emily and Tyler." He turned to face me. "I want to do better. This honest conversation marked a turning point. It didn't erase the past, but it opened a path toward a healthier future relationship. Jeffrey would never again have the unquestioning trust I once gave him, but he could earn a different kind of trust, based on mutual respect. Diane took longer to adjust to the new reality. Her resentment lingered beneath polite interactions, emerging in subtle digs and backhanded compliments. During a tour of the community center, she commented, "It's nice they try to make these places seem like regular neighborhoods instead of retirement communities." "This isn't a retirement community, Diane," I corrected gently. "It's an all-ages condominium complex that happens to be popular with active seniors. My next-door neighbors are in their 30s. By the visit's final days, even Diane had begun to unbend slightly, particularly after seeing how happy the children were spending time with me in this new setting. Emily had expressed interest in returning for a summer art program affiliated with my watercolor class, and Tyler had made friends with a boy his age whose grandparents lived in the community. The night before their departure, I shared my plans for the grandchildren's education funds. I had established trust accounts that would provide for their college expenses, accessible when they turned 18. "That's incredibly generous," Mom Jeffrey said, genuine gratitude in his voice. "Education was always important to your father and me," I replied. "He would want his grandchildren to have that opportunity." I didn't mention the conditions I'd attached to these funds, which Margaret had helped me establish. The children would receive this support regardless of their parents' relationship with me, but Jeffrey and Diane would have no access or control over the money. As I watched them drive away the next morning, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for months. The visit hadn't been perfect, but it had been honest. We were building a new kind of family relationship, one based on reality, rather than obligation or expectation. In the year since discovering Jeffrey's betrayal, I had learned profound lessons about family aging and self-worth. I realized that true family honors each member's autonomy and dignity, that aging doesn't diminish a person's right to self-determination, that my value wasn't tied to what I owned or could provide to others. The money from selling my Connecticut home had given me freedom, but the real treasure was discovering my own resilience. At 72, I had completely reinvented my life. I'd made new friends, developed new interests, even begun a tentative relationship with Thomas, my watercolor instructor, whose patient guidance had evolved into coffee dates and concert outings. I had set aside funds for the grandchildren's education and my own potential healthcare needs. The rest I was using to live fully in the present. I'd booked a photography tour of the national parks for the fall. Thomas and I were planning a trip to Santa Fe for their art festival. My calendar held more adventures than obligations. The house in Connecticut had been a repository of memories, both joyful and painful. I had thought leaving it would mean losing those memories, but I discovered they traveled with me, transformed by time and perspective. Harold was still present in my life, through the treasured possessions I'd brought with me and the values we'd shared. Jeffrey's childhood remained preserved in photo albums and stories I could choose to revisit or not. What I'd left behind was the burden of others' expectations, the weight of being needed rather than wanted. In its place, I found community based on mutual respect and genuine connection. If you're watching this and facing your own crossroads, remember that it's never too late to stand up for your worth. Family relationships should enrich your life, not diminish it. Sometimes the greatest act of love, both for yourself and others, is establishing boundaries that honor your dignity. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to make a difficult decision to protect your own well-being? How did you find the courage to make a change? Please like and subscribe if my story resonated with you, and share it with someone who might need to hear that. They deserve respect at every stage of life. Thank you for listening, and remember, the key to your happiness belongs in your hands alone.